So today I'd like to introduce and welcome Terri Sebree, who is the president of Zanurba, among other things that she'll describe. I have known Terri, I think for, I want to say maybe 15 years or more.
I
And
think 15 years.
yeah, and it has been such a joy. Terri, in her former role as president of New Path, went and met with people at the University of Pennsylvania and sought out academic technology that she could bring into the company she ran and move that technology out into practice. She has worked in large pharma, small pharma, startups. She's brought many, many products from concept through regulatory approval and into the market. And she's been a fierce champion for working with academics, not just because it was a fruitful way to access technology, but because it really enhanced the impact of their work and brought things through the virtuous cycle in the way that we all hope will happen. Terri can tell you more about her background, but as she leads us through this talk today on, I want to translate my research, how can industry help me? I'm hoping this is a very interactive session and that you all feel comfortable asking questions, interrupting, and seeking her guidance, because she can really, really help you move your research into practice. So with that, Terri, welcome to the USC Career Development Seminar Series, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to this. If I'm looking at my slides, I'm not going to see if you have a question. So Karen and Steve, I'll ask you to alert me if there are questions, and I hope there are questions. And Steve's going to, I think, join the conversation because, as I said, we've worked 16 years together in various roles. So he has a lot of perspective from what it's like to work with a pharmaceutical company, the good and the bad. So it will be great to hear from him too. But please ask questions as we go forward. I think that'll make it a much better presentation. So as Steve said, I'm president of Zanurba. I'm also on the board of directors of a Norwegian company called Serodis. I'll tell you a little bit about Zanurba in a moment. And Serodis is working on diabetic kidney disease. I started my career off working for Sebree Pharmaceuticals, which is a French pharmaceutical company. Then I worked for Abbott Laboratories, and which it was still a pharmaceutical company. It was a long time ago. And then I went to work for a contract research organization in Philadelphia and ran their U.S. operations. And from there, I've done 3 companies: Auxilium, which was sold to Endo Pharmaceuticals, New Path, which was sold to Teva, and now Zanurba. So I've learned all the nitty-gritty of working for a small company, but also big pharma. So just to tell you, well, this is just the overview. I'll tell you a little bit about Zanurba. We'll go through definitions. Just want to make sure everybody understood what I was talking about. Cost and timelines for typical drug development or biologic development, and why I think we need collaborations with universities. I think it's essential for pharma to survive. Well, what I think you need to do is establish a connection and key considerations for collaborations. And I tried to do that from the point of view of somebody in a university and also somebody in pharma and how they think about it. But I think I have some just practical tips for you too as you move to collaborations. And if there's anything else we want to talk about, we can do that at the end. So Zanurba has cannabidiol gel, which is CBD, but it's pharmaceutically produced, and it's a transdermal that's systemically absorbed. So I've worked a lot in transdermals, and we're using it to we're looking at it in Fragile X and in 22q deletion syndrome, and also in autism. I'll talk about those in a little bit, but all neuropsychiatric diseases This was actually licensed from the University of Kentucky, and we started working on it about 8 years ago, and we're in phase 3. So it's just typical, pretty slow drug development. But when we licensed it, it had just been had proof of concept in animals, and from there we've taken it to do all the non-clinical work and the phase 1, 2, and 3, and we're now in our final studies before we file to the FDA. So these are our programs. So we're looking at Zygel in Fragile X syndrome and autism. So in Fragile X, we're in our pivotal study. Autism will be starting our pivotal phase 3 studies this year. And then 22q deletion syndrome, we are in an open label study. So that's a phase 2, trying to get proof of concept. As probably a lot of people know, in psychiatric diseases, it's hard to get very good proof of concept in animals. I think that's one of the differences of what pharmaceutical requires. So just talk about a few definitions. Probably all of you know this, but phase 1, I just wanted to talk because I talk a lot about phases of clinical research. Phase 1 is the research done. It's the first research you do, and that's in healthy subjects, or maybe if it's in controlled patients. But it's really usually the first time you're introducing the drug to humans. So you usually do it in normal subjects, and that's where you look at the safety, tolerability. You look at the pharmacokinetics. If there are biomarkers, you look at that, and maybe perhaps with some patients in the study, you can get proof of principle. And importantly, you can determine your maximum tolerated dose, or the maximum feasible dose. In transdermals, it's often maximum feasible dose. Phase 2 is when you move into your patient populations, and it's very tight. The patients, you try to get patients who are very similar to each other. So you have a restrictive inclusion-exclusion criteria. You do want your proof of concept. You need FDA and the EMA, the European Medicine Authority, both require you to have dose ranging and have your maximum tolerated dose, but maybe in your lowest minimal effective dose, something that pharma has a hard time doing because we always get ahead of ourselves and want to get into bigger studies. Phase 3 are the big studies. That's where you really loosen up your inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you try to get more real-world patients. They're often very big studies, and they're either long-term treatment in a double-blind study, or you allow patients to go into open label, because you need to end up with patients with 1 year exposure and 6 months exposure. And once you finish the phase 3, then you file your NDA or BLA. And all through this program, you're going to be characterizing your pharmacokinetics, looking at drug-drug interactions, looking at abuse liability, looking at QT liability. That's still a big issue with FDA. And you may be developing new formulations that are better tolerated or easier to dose. There's a lot of different reasons that you look at new formulations. After you finish phase 3, well, before you go into humans, you need to file an investigational new drug application, so an IND. And you usually meet with FDA ahead of that, about 3 to 12 months ahead of your IND submission. You meet with FDA and you talk about what your first study is going to be. You actually talk about your whole development program, and you start getting some interaction from FDA. You'll talk about endpoints. That's another big issue to establish early, is what your endpoints are going to be. And then you submit your IND. You have to have quite a bit of your animal toxicology done. You need to have your manufacturing process laid out, along with analytical testing. And as I said, your first protocol for the initial human studies. And once it's submitted, if you don't hear from FDA in 30 days, you can start the study. Usually you hear from them and they will have 1 or 2 issues. But if you've gone to a pre-NDA meeting, you can be assured that you're going to be able to start your study within 30 to 60 days of filing your IND. After you complete phase 3, you'll either file a new drug application, if the results are positive, you'll file a new drug application or a BLA. So first I'm going to talk about the new drug application. So once you complete your phase 3 studies, which are usually 2 double-blind, large, well-controlled studies, it might just be one large or larger study if it's an orphan disease, and you have a pre-NDA meeting with FDA, and there you really you try to go through all the issues, so you know if there's going to be any issues that are going to make your drug approval to be held up. And then after the meeting, FDA will let you know within 60 days if they accept the filing. You might hear it as FDA invited a company to I've heard that a lot during COVID, to file an NDA, and that's just because that's what they call it after you've had the pre-NDA meeting with them. During the NDA review, FDA will come out and inspect manufacturing facilities. They'll inspect clinical sites, and they may also inspect the pharma company just to make sure that you've complied with all the regulations. And there are 2 types of original NDAs. There's a 505(b)(1), which is the traditional pathway for a new chemical entity or a compound that has not been approved by the FDA previously. And then there's a 505(b)(2), and that could be a new formulation of a drug already approved, new indications where you're not the sponsor company, but you're a new company. So those are, the 505(b)(2) is a quicker pathway. You don't have as long data exclusivity, but it can work for some products. The other, if you're not filing an NDA, you're going to file a biologics license application called a BLA. And that is very similar to an NDA, but it's for viruses, therapeutic serums, toxins, antitoxins, vaccine, and blood products. And everything is very similar, except there is even a higher standard of purity. So that's just one of the differences there. You have to ensure that it's very pure, your product, and there's a whole guidances on that. So now I'm going to move into just talking about cost and timeline for drug development. So this looks like this is industry propaganda, but it's not. It's actually a study done by the Tufts Center for Study Drug Development. It was published in the Journal of Health Economics in 2016. And when you take into account failed products that don't make it to approval, the typical cost of a drug is $2.6 billion. I mean, that's a staggering amount of money, but that was the results. They surveyed 10 multinational companies, and it covered 105 investigational compounds. So even if you half that, it's still staggering the amount of money it costs to develop a drug now. And I'm sure, as you've all heard, it's a very few drugs, therapeutics, whatever, make it to the market. So if you start off in drug discovery, and I have this presented 2 different ways, but 5,000 to 10,000 compounds, 250 make it into what we call preclinical. So that would be toxicology, proof of principle in animals, studies like that. And from those 250, 5 make it into phase 1. And out of that, you will get one NDA approved product. So it's a little bit mind-blowing when you think about that.
So Terri, may I interrupt here?
Please.
So when I saw this, I tried to imagine, where did I enter this stream when working with NewPath? And I came down on the 250.
Right, I think that's right.
So, and I thought 1 out of 250, those aren't great odds, but they're a lot better than 1 to 10,000. So where would you recommend, for the people in the audience, if they were thinking, I need to get to a certain point before I can meaningfully interact with industry? Is it, to get yourself into the 1 to 250 range? Or do you have any more sort of guidance on when's the right time?
Yeah, I think we'll talk about that a little bit, but I think you at least have to have a good scientific rationale. You need to probably have proof of concept in your animals and an animal model. And so maybe it's a little bit, but it's also good, and we can talk about that, how you interact with industry, but it may be good to understand what they're going to want for proof of concept, or what kind of scientific rationale they want. So I don't think you can be back in the 5,000, but maybe it's somewhere in that. There has to be a little bit where it's more like 1,000. So, and that you can start talking to industry and understand what they're going to want and what they're going to need. We'll talk about some of the basic things you need, but I think you need to have a pretty good definition of what you're doing before you talk to them. But you can't be too far into the preclinical, or sometimes it's clinical, but that usually industry wants to license it before you start clinical studies, so that because a big thing about industry is control. Did that answer, Steve?
Yeah, yes, and more. So I love that you did a prelude to what industry wants to be able to control and why. Right.
Yeah.
So when we say things like that, it sort of leaves it hanging and it sounds like a negative. But in fact, I'm sure you'll get to, it's not a negative. It's they want to control things to make sure they're done right, which will improve your chances of moving forward.
Right. And so that is with clinical studies, they want to make sure they're done right, that you control how you do it. You do it with people with experience and investigators with experience, so you don't end up with some random adverse event that might destroy the product or drug that didn't need to happen. So I think everybody has seen, and we'll talk, good drugs that just don't make it because of some mistake early in the development of the drug. Another way to look at this, and this is a little bit, it took me a while to figure this paper out, and from this, but what the right-hand side says, from a time a product enters phase 1, you have about a 12% chance of getting an NDA or BLA approval, which sounds terrible, but I don't actually think that's as terrible as I thought it would be. So when you're in phase 1, you have about a 60% chance of it moving to phase 2 and 3. And that's where, it's hard to get out of phase 2 and 3. From there, you have about a 35% chance of it moving to final phase 3 and NDA, or BLA. But once you submit an NDA or BLA, there's a 9% chance of it being approved. So you really are not going to submit an NDA unless you think it's going to be approved, and a company won't submit it. I think what happens in those 10% is probably something blew up as in your late studies after your submission was already submitted. So about a 1 in 10 chance once it enters human clinical trials, which I don't think is so terrible. And interesting, the timelines for developing a drug have not really increased, and I would have thought that was that it would have. And this is from entering phase 1 to an NDA or BLA submission. So you can see you have some. I can't even imagine 45 years, but I don't know what those are. But but most of them are. It's the median time is about 8.3 years. It's quicker for drugs that get emergency authorization, such as the COVID vaccines. I think that's a very good example of moving very fast. Orphan drugs take longer just because there is not much of a population. It's hard to find patients for it. But this is for 405 products that were analyzed. So I think it's interesting. It hasn't gotten faster and it hasn't gotten slower in the last 10 years. So I think everybody knows at times, pharma, biotech, I'm called pharma, it could be industry. I mean, it's from little tiny pharma, like we call ourselves pharma, we're probably biotech, to the big companies. At times, the collaborations have not been easy, and we're going to talk about some of that. But I just think, I tried to put what in some of the papers I found of why. And I should have said this, I sent out a survey to about 5 different people in industry, and you'll see them at the bottom of my of some of my citations, but I talked to the CEO of a small cap pharma company. I talked to a head of regulatory of a medium-sized contract research organization. I talked to a really good IP lawyer, and I talked to a person who was head of development of a big pharma, and then then he ran a venture capital fund. So it was interesting. They all had different, and I'll talk about that now as I go along. They all had different ideas, but it all came back to about the same thing. But this is my opinion and the industry's opinion. So I think that you have to take that with my bias, but and that, sometimes academia has downplayed the practical applications of findings. Steve didn't. I mean, Steve understood what he had, and it was really important to industry. And so that, I think that sometimes people don't understand that or make a big enough deal of it. Publication is important, and I think this is changing, but IP and patent applications have not always been a priority. And that's just, we'll talk about, this will come up over and over again, but you have to get your patent applications filed, and you have to, before you present it or publish it. And so I think there is a lot of why things blow up is because there's not good IP, and a company's not going to spend, $500 million to develop a product without good IP. And this is, I already talked about it. You can't, in a pharma company, you really cannot sell an idea to license it in if you don't have proof of concept, because when you go out and meet with people and try to get something from a university, you're just not going to get any place if you don't have proof of concept in animals. Many times, pharma wants to replicate that proof of concept, but they have set ways to do it. They have their in vitro and in vivo methods, and it may not be very applicable. Mostly things are innovative. So I think industry shoots themselves in the foot often because they don't, they just have their way of doing it. It's always, like, probably you talk about too, NIH, not invented here. I mean, it's a problem, and it's a problem in laboratories at pharma companies. And I think, everybody's trying to move people to think differently about, and maybe you don't have to replicate everything that's been done at a university. And that's kind of the next thing you have to have scientific rationale, and you really need a clear development pathway, but that's not always going to be the case, because sometimes it's a new drug that's never been nothing's ever been developed for that indication, for that patient population. And so nobody really knows how to develop it. And that is hard. It's also great. It's what industry needs, but it makes it harder. And this is what I've already talked, that you need a broad portfolio with strong IP protection. So, you may have several applications that have been filed, but obviously we need to work better together and try to figure out how to get the two groups together. This next slide is just, it was a survey that Novartis did of 187 projects. So you can tell they're huge. So it was 416 people from Novartis and 253 academic partners. And it's interesting that most things that were the pressing challenges, everybody agreed on. It's always resources. There's never enough resources. But what was different, what I thought was interesting was scientific challenges. Academia thought it was much more difficult than industry. And then goal alignment challenges, though industry thought it was more difficult than academic. So I think that's just where the difference in the yin and yang of university and industry exists. Any questions? So
yeah, if I may jump in, actually, for the not necessarily the preceding slide, but the slide before that, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And specifically because this gets into, what stage is one at and how does one prepare to have the conversations with pharma. And so when one is thinking about IP and then approaching pharma, there's either going to be, you know, the compound or the utility of the compound, i.e. utility being more of a drug repurposing. How does that factor into the accessibility that pharma has based on that level of patent protection?
Well, you know, that will be something they'll look at. So of course, if you can have a composition of matter patent, then you have no questions. But I mean, there's not many. I mean, everything I've worked on recently, there hasn't been a composition of matter patent. So it's just, I mean, and it's amazing the things you can patent it. And Steve did it, and then we did it together. I mean, we patent the PK level of a drug. I mean, we patent all around things. So I think you just, and that's that whole, what we call a picket fence. So can you do PK level? Can you do a use patent? Can you do a formulation patent? And you can, I mean, of course it costs money too, but you can file a lot of patent applications. That doesn't cost so much money. And then if you get a collaboration, then you can move, that's one of the things we'll talk about. You can move that cost to industry. So I think it's just, so the commercial people at a pharmaceutical company are going to have to feel like they can get back all the money that's invested and make a good return on it. So it's just how have you blocked out competition? You'll get 5 years exclusivity just on any NDA or BLA you file and get approved, but then how many other ways can you take care of? How can you block competition? And I think that's where you have to think creatively. Steve and I got things I never really thought we could ever get. Do you want to add to that, Steve?
So I would agree that doing an objective sort of assessment of what we ended up having really solid patent protection for, you might not have anticipated in advance. So drugs that were on the market, materials that had been used before, concepts and ways of doing things that, you know, there was precedent for, just maybe hadn't been, but it turned out doing it this way, this drug, this polymer, this method, this geometry, that we were able to get good enough patent protection around that we got a ruling that nobody could move in this space without us, which was surprising, but very helpful.
So, yeah. So I think, and that's where you just have to, that's where you may throw a lot into patent applications, and then it can get refined before they're issued. And you get, as you start working with IP lawyers, they are really good about refining it, adding, doing supplemental filing. So it's just trying to think of anything that's novel before you present it, that you do an application. I don't know if that's practical to think you can do that, but that's the right way to try to think about it. Mm-hmm. Is that in your experience, Steve? Can you do that in a university setting?
In some, right? So Penn evolves over the 20 years I was there. They evolved from a system where you had to reach into tech transfer and pull people kicking and screaming to a really streamlined process that allowed for easy, vetting, easy filing, and relatively easy provisional patents, even a week before you were going to present. So I think one of the take homes was having a working relationship, a good working relationship with that office allows you to do things quickly and easily. It's very hard to say, I'm presenting at a meeting next month and I'd like to file a provisional. And by the way, my name's Michael, right? That's hard. On the other hand, saying, hey, Bob, it's Steve. I just realized that we're going to be presenting something next month that might benefit from patent protection. Can we pull together a provisional quickly? If that guy knows you, it's a quick meeting, it's a quick provisional, and that gets you a year to get your ducks in a row.
Yeah. And so that was your experience at Penn. How has your experience been working with Stevens here?
I think I think they've been enthusiastic. I would actually have to be honest, the limits of that here have been that I don't do this anymore. And so I think when I first got here, they reached out. They were very eager to sort of get to know what I did and how they could help. It turns out I don't do this kind of work, but in the sense that they were interested, I thought it was good. I just don't, I'm not sure that we yet have the easy turnkey, go to the website, pull down the form, submit your idea, get a quick read on whether they're going to be interested or not, and then move to either a provisional or not. Has anyone in the audience, let's get to sort of more audience participation, if that's okay. Has anyone here reached out to the Stevens Center or to MESH and expressed interest in patents? And if so, how did it go to, for you? Michael, how did it go?
It's been okay. It's been a slow process in terms of one, building up relationships, and then two, at least for me, it's first time through it. So there's a lot of inefficiencies on my end with it. But it's also been partly personnel turnover that's been happening. And so if your department or institution appointed contact is then moving on, then you have a new relationship. And then if that person moves on, a new relationship. And so over the past year and a half, I'm on my third person, for example.
And that's probably unusual. That's the times, right?
It's COVID and everything's up in the air, and yeah.
But it's important. So I had 3 relationships in my 20 years at Penn. One person brought the concept forward and really got everything moving. Second person took the ball and ran with it, and then she left Penn, but I still talk to her a couple of times a year just to touch base. She still retained the relationship. She moved to that job at another university, but relationships were very important. And then the third person took over the portfolio. I've been gone 6 years and I still talk to her 3-4 times a year. So you can't say enough about building and maintaining those relationships. Even when the person leaves, they're still part of your story and you want to retain that relationship.
So, and I'm going to go through some more, or at least I think practical things as we get into the, as I get more into the presentation. But obviously industry needs to collaborate. I mean, and there's COVID vaccines are the amazing example, but there's a lot of examples and more examples of innovation coming from universities and academia and not from pharma labs. And people, companies are dumping labs and really relying on being able to get innovative products from universities. And I think this is an important number, and they're kind of old, but from 93 to 2004, R&D spending increased by 147%, but the number of NDAs submitted only rose to 38%. And that's some of, pharma just cannot afford labs and all of that. Has really changed since I started.
Can I ask a question about that, Terri? Please?
Yes.
Yeah, so a few years ago, and by a few years ago, I mean probably 8, thinking back towards the end of my time at Penn, there seemed to be a shift where companies went from having, 100 shots on goal internally, where they were seeding the money and having 1 in 100 go forward, rather to really sort of gutting their internal investment in research and trying to push that early phase out to startups. So now it became 1 in 100 companies belly up, go forward, 99 belly up, and industry buys the 1. Is that something that has continued, or has there been a shift back to internal development?
I don't think so. I mean, sometimes they will take on a specialty and increase their labs, but I think that not anymore. It's just too expensive. And and doing animal research is almost, I think, impossible now in companies. So I think there's still a shift to either move it out, startups, contract it out, but really trying to find the innovative ideas in universities, or the startups and little companies find them and then the big companies buy them. So I don't think there's, not like there used to be where there was just so many labs and work done in pharma companies.
Thank you.
Obviously, I think everybody knows why you should collaborate. It's a way to get your product or your biologic or technology to commercialize into patients. And most of us want to, to really help. We're working on these things to make advances in therapeutics and medicine. It gives you research and resource stream. Even if the companies don't have the internal resources, they have the ability to contract it out. There's a lot of contract research done now. You will be able to collaborate globally with leaders in the field, and you learn a lot about other things other people are doing and what's going on globally. You learn drug development, and there's financial opportunities. You will benefit financially from this, and you are obligated, if it's going to help the American public, and you've had funding from the government, you need to try to move your product along. So how do you establish a pharma industry connection? So I'll go through that, but I think current models now are still amazingly one-off. One company, one investigator, or what we call investigator, one person in pharma, and that, that's not very efficient. It's, it works, but it's not very efficient. Or companies support a university institution. There's it was Novartis. Was it Novartis, Steve, that supported all big companies support some institution. I can't remember who it was at Penn.
So there were, I think, relationships with Novartis, but there was a broader program to build single contract templates across an entire company. So we did have, for a brief period, a very, very effective office in the School of Medicine that advocated for and effectively created master agreements with all of the big companies.
Yeah, that's
and
amazing.
So
yeah.
It was really helpful. So when you'd go to J&J, you didn't have to create a one-off, or Lilly or Novartis. There was an existing template that said, this is the relationship between Novartis and Penn. Here's the IP parts are sort of largely negotiated. The funded research is largely negotiated. The relationships are there. You could then go to that office and shop your idea, and they would also know the landscape to go out to pharma and say, are you interested in this? So that kind of office was incredibly facilitating.
And that is incredibly unusual, I think, too. And then the other thing that happens are VC, venture capital investments. So they also go out and look, and they'll find something they like. They may take the academics and just spin off a company. So the product or the technology or whatever could go in the company, and usually they'll take one or two academics, and you get then your money comes from private equity and venture capital, and that's the good and bad of that. And then there's fee for services. I think those are the main collaborations now, but things are changing. When I started, I'm old, but when I started at Abbott in the 80s, there was so much high throughput screening, and Abbott wasn't that big, but every company had high throughput screening. And that is one of the things that really they don't do anymore. And now that is, really done by academic centers and non-industry centers throughout the world. So, and they're capable of, and so that is really what we rely on now. Also, NIH has support centers that develop probes for diseases that aren't particularly interesting to pharma, but then I think trying to build interest. And there's charitable funding, you know, that's another way to move your product along. And, you know, I think now pharma and biotech understand how important it is to have relationships with universities. And it's important for the whole environmental culture of pharma science to help, you know, to work with universities. And that's totally changed since since the 80s and 90s. And I just tried to give examples on the next slide, but maybe y'all can add some of existing collaborations. So, you know, at CAC, there was, I think we found these online, and then Steve had us add is it Aria? Is that how you say it? Aria, Kim,
Yes.
Kim Div, Adler, and Shield, but I'm sure there's other ones, and I don't know if anybody else knows of any others at USC.
So maybe this can be our moment to ask people, who
Yeah.
are you working with? And are these good relationships that you could potentially share with each other?
Anybody? Okay. So we can come back to that, and you can see that, you know, different, there are examples throughout industry and universities. So where do you start? You know, I think you start thinking about it now. And how do you find who you need to talk to? So you can talk to your technology transfer group. That sounds like that's called the Stevens Institute or something like that. So,
Yes.
and I think that's important what Steve said, get to know them, tell them what you're doing. Look at your therapeutic area, which companies have existing products or research in that area. Go to meetings, seek those people out, talk to them. I think that, you know, and talk to people in industry, that's important. And just, you know, get to know them. You know, your academic collaborators, you know, either at your university or different universities, do they have relationships with pharma and biotech? Do they know anybody? Will it be a cold call? And you can do that and it works, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But, you know, I think you should start and know that it's like anything, it's going to take a while. But if you start developing the relationships, if you start talking to people who ever get to go back to scientific meetings, I think that's a good way. Yes, Steve.
So I think back on the path to meet you, right? And it's always been important to me that you were not the first or the second or probably even, you know, the fifth industry representatives I presented to. So with each ensuing presentation and pitch, I got feedback, it got better. And so on the day that Terri Fatum, the person I mentioned earlier, introduced me to NewPath, I had a much more polished presentation that anticipated the needs, the issues, et cetera, than I would have if that had been the first. And I'm almost sure that if I'd met you first, I would not have presented in a way that was appealing. So, you know, to bring that to the group, it was really important to go up to people at meetings from industry at their posters and say, how do you do? I'm Steve. I have this idea. You know, do you think your company might be interested? And then go give presentations, even the ones that didn't land. I always got some feedback that made the next presentation better, so that it was in a place it needed to be when there was a really receptive person on the other end.
And then from after Steve presented, the woman I co-founded NewPath with, we were driving the car back, and we were like, we have to get that technology now. So it was a very effective presentation, but then it took a year for us to come to an agreement, but that still was pretty quick. So these are things that either people told me I know, or there's a little bit from publications, but it's going to be some of the same things you heard before, but I will just have to keep preaching about IP. If you're finding this novel and think about what's novel, immediately start the IP process at your institution. even, and this was from the IP lawyer, she's just seen the most novel finding won't get off the ground without IP. So, I mean, you can't make that mistake of presenting before you file IP. And these are all her comments. This is one of the most overlooked areas. It can sink you before you even begin. And do not present or publish data without filed patent applications. I think Steve calls them provisional. We call them patent applications. But then you also need so this is the yin and yang of, but you also need to find a way to share your data with pharma, even if your data is not yet published. So you've got to get confidentiality agreements in place. So, you have to be able to nimbly move through that. I saw you came off mute, Steve.
Yeah, I struggled with whether, so I saw this presentation advance, and I struggled with whether I should write back to Terri about this. And I think it's probably better to just discuss it with the group here. So I tried to remember what I sent J&J with regards to confidential information, whether it was the specific technology that ultimately ended with NewPath or some of the other ideas, right? Because there were a lot of shots on goal, not just the one that took traction. But I have this nagging feeling that everyone who was involved in those confidential disclosures is gone, right? The people at Penn are gone. I don't remember. And every time I see, J&J is coming out with a 6-month antipsychotic delivery system, which is what we have, right? And I keep wondering, did they just steal my idea and trust that Penn would never be able to track this? Just pure incompetence, right? You just bank on the incompetence of your academic partner and steal with impunity.
I don't think that happens very often. But companies do track it. So if you get a CDA with the company, J&J probably has it, but that's why you need to have, they are conscious of that and they have to be careful of it. They might do it, but I don't think they do. But if you get that CDA in place, it's on notice that they can't do that. They shouldn't do it. And I don't think most times do it, but
so
it's hard to cross. You never know exactly where that idea came from, right? So.
And that's the other part that's always lingers, right? Is they may have known that before you shared your confidential agreement. And I know, Terri, is there a mechanism? I don't remember anyone ever getting back to us across all the confidentiality agreements and saying, oh, by the way, we already knew that, right? It just sort of was like a sharing of information.
Right. Well, yeah, that is true. But I think if you have it in place, you're in better shape, right? You at least are, and the company's going to want to make sure that you ultimately collaborate with. They're going to try. They will now. I think this is new too. They do audits of IP audits, and part of the IP audit is making sure you had CDA, what we call CDAs. They're also called NDAs in place. The other thing is share good data and bad data. Don't just give the good picture and not talk about any warts or anything else in your data, because that can also, that's from my point of view, can sink it because you just lose trust that people aren't telling you everything. And you need to have an explanation for any abnormal tox finding. It doesn't mean that it's going to kill it, but you just need to, if you have something weird that pops up in animal studies, you need to just have an explanation for it. And again, disclose it. I think this is the next one, is hard. Be prepared to have your data reviewed and critiqued. And those people may not know a thing about what they're talking about in industry, but they're going to tell you everything you did wrong. I remember at times Steve bristling, and everybody bristles because you just are like, you've got to be kidding, but you got to put up with that. You're going to have people tell you a lot of stuff that might be wrong, but you just have to let it roll off your back. And your data will need to be replicated. And maybe we'll move away from that, but that's how it is now. But if you talk to pharma early, then I think you can understand, then you start understanding what they need, how you're going to replicate it. And, and you're going to track your methods and everything so you can once you have a collaboration, you can give that to them so they can maybe follow the same methods. I have a few more on data. I got a lot of feedback from a lot of, and so this is kind of what I'm talking about. So basic study components, and this is even for animal studies, needs to be prepared before you start your work. So you need a study protocol. It can be pretty simple, but you need a study protocol that has predefined assessments and endpoints. You need an analysis plan. You need a report. And if you have to do it retrospectively, it diminishes the value of the data. This actually all came from the guy who's regulatory, so this is important for him. It's maybe not as important early stage, but it's still important. At least you should have materials and methods of how you did things, so it can be replicated. And I already talked about this. The more novel your technology or product, the more difficult it is to establish a regulatory pathway. And also the determine manufacturer feasibility. I mean, that's something that's hard to think about, how you're going to scale it for 1 or 2 animals to tens of thousands of patients. I mean, it's unbelievable what you have to do in manufacturing. Yes, Steve.
Yeah. So, when you think about the assays, things like that, this was something I learned along the way working with you, that there are published methods in the USP for how to do certain kinds of assays. And one, it's just helpful so you don't have to figure it out yourself. But the other thing I learned that is if you will do it that way, so you sign on and say, I used the USP method to do the assay, that's much more likely to be accepted by FDA later than if you say, I know there's you may not even know it, right? I didn't know there was a USP method, so I made up my own method. Now they have to validate your assay as well as your data. So if you're doing assays to assess the some profile of your product, try to use the USP method, because that's going to leap, A, it's validated, it's a good method, but B, if you choose to do it that way, it's just easier to move forward from a regulatory perspective.
And so it is, I mean, that may be hard to even conceive, but you need to try to have a pathway to how you're going to manufacture and scale up. That may not be feasible, but I mean, that is something, as you work with industry, I think you figure that out more. And the other thing, you have to make sure it's going to that you can achieve an acceptable cost of goods when it goes to market. So, and that's all going to depend on the disease and the novelty. If something is going to be used in diabetes, it's going to have to be a pretty cheap cost of goods. Where if it's, gene therapy, it can be very expensive. But these are just things you have to start thinking about and figuring out some of, how you're going to explain that to your collaborator, what you think the cost of goods would be, or how, the show, maybe it's not so expensive to manufacture, even though it's costing a lot right now.
I mean, I don't know is that part of people's consciousness? It'd be great if people would sort of chime in. When I started, we had a manufacturing process which turned out to be very, very impractical. But I didn't know that. And so, well into the development stream, we had to go back, have a new method of production, and then replicate the kinetics, the release profiles, not knowing whether or not the new manufacturing process would do that. So it would have been really helpful up front to be thinking, how am I going to scale this? What's going to make it through the regulatory process? And can I go down a manufacturing pathway so I won't have to retool in the middle? Does anyone here think about that, or is this kind of a foreign concept or just not relevant?
Sorry, the sun was going down where I am. So it's probably hard to think about it, and but that's something, as you go to meetings, and you may be able to think about it more. But it's something you do need to think about. That actually came from he was head of R&D at big pharma, which I was surprised he even thought about that. But I was like, oh, I even forgot to mention that. So it's important to think about going to IP. We've talked about it some already, well, a lot, but understand your obligations. Who owns the inventions? Do you own it? Does the university? Usually the university. You usually get some part of it. And understand how the IP rights will flow. You just need to understand that. And as you do collaborations, how the IP rights will flow. And this is where I talked about let pharma pay or industry pay for the IP. So you do the applications, then you get a collaboration. And we spend, even as a small company, we spend millions a year on IP. So that's something pharma will pay for. And bigger companies have IP lawyers. So let them pay for it. You need to make sure that you have long patent life. I don't think that usually is a problem so much, but you need to have long patent life. And the IP protection, you want to make sure it's not too broad. So this is the kind of different too, but for you, it's not too broad and doesn't extend too far into the future. So it's that whole sweet spot you need to be, but you don't want to block any other potential collaborations because you have such broad IP.
Can you speak to the impact this has on what people should realistically expect as terms?
Yeah,
I know my own experience. I don't think it's terribly unusual, but I don't really know. My impression is that New Path and subsequently Teva probably put tens of millions into patent protection and similar numbers into pre-phase 3. There's then probably hundreds of millions once you get to the phase 3 pivotal trials. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I don't, but we're a small company, but we won't touch anything that has, more than 2 or 3 or 4% royalties, right? We don't, because we're gonna raise money, and some way that equity costs a lot of money. Either, some way it's gonna cost money. We're gonna probably, want somebody to take over from us. So, our shareholders want to make money. So I mean, and that's what everybody, I think, this is someplace in the presentation, but it's not very much that you're gonna, if it's not in clinical, you're gonna get 2 or 3 or 4%. I can't remember even what it was for you. Do you?
1.5% decreasing to 1% if
Okay.
it over time. The longer it took to develop, the less the university got.
Right.
And the inventors typically get 1/3.
Yeah, which is
that, which is actually very generous. And then depending on how many inventors, you can sort of very quickly end with something 0.2%. But the reason I think it's so important to recognize is you typically don't have $10 million to pump into IP, another 10 million to pump into phase 1, phase 2, let alone hundreds of millions to go to phase 3. So 0.2% of something is a whole lot better than 100% of nothing.
Right. But it is, it is sometimes I meet people who think they're going to get 10, 20% royalty. And I mean, at that point, you walk away because it's like, oh, it's too hard to work. But are you explaining? They do understand. So, but yeah, so it's not much. But it's still, but your product, and then there are also milestone payments, which can also be helpful as INDs are filed. Phase 3 starts NDA. So, and you usually get some of that, and the university gets some of that. And that's this next point. Many good drugs don't progress because ownership and licensing setup is so unattractive to pharma. So when we took over on Zanurba, they actually did have a 20% royalty payment to it was a different university, in fact, and we negotiated all that away. We wouldn't even start at the company until that went away, because that, was so, we wouldn't have been able to raise money, equity, the money to do any of the research. Nobody would have given us money. So it's really, and that's that second bullet. Active licenses with high royalties, you're not going to get pharma interested. And you have to, we just talked about all of this. I think that one of these is important. And second to last bullet point is important. You're not going to maintain a lot of control over the project. And, I said, it's like, industry has adopted your baby and they're going to raise them, not you. And that's really hard, because this is something you might have worked 5, 6, 10 years on. And suddenly they might not care that much because they know they have their way of doing it, and they're going to have their way. We're talking about some ways you can stay involved, but you have to really, as it gets farther along, you're not going to have as much say. And what you think you're going to develop for, they may have a different idea of a different indication. They can go in different new directions, and projects can be discontinued. I think Steve has something to say. Then I'm going to talk about how you protect yourself then on that.
So I was trying to look up the name of the person I'm about to mention. His first name was Terri. I think the last name started with an R. He was a former provost at Penn who went off into industry, had a huge career there, and then came back as kind of a mentoring force. I went to him at one point and said, I'm really getting uncomfortable. I'm losing control. I'm not sure I want to do this. And in the space of just a few minutes, he converted me. He said, basically, losing control is the best thing that can happen to you. Truth be told, you don't know how to do this, right? You not only do you not know how to do this, but you can't. The very fact that someone in industry wants control of your product is astounding. It's fantastic. Let go. This is the only path forward for you. Go have another kind of academic career. This is your path to success. It was great. So he completely reframed this idea of control from, they're going to steward this forward appropriately. They're not going to let you destroy it. Right? I don't know if that resonates, Terri, but it was very effective in having me not just relinquish control, but relish the fact that I was getting to relinquish control.
And one of the ways in projects are discontinued, it may still be a good project. So you can have the university should have some kind of clawback provision. So if the company doesn't spend so much money or hit some kind of developmental milestones in X amount of time, or spend X amount of dollars in X amount of time, university gets it back. That's important, because you don't want somebody just to license it to kill it, right? So you need to make sure you get that clawback provision in there so that doesn't happen.
So Perry Molinoff was his name, by the way. So it turns out, doing a quick search on Provost Penn, Perry R. somehow. Perry Molinoff is the guy who had that insight. Can you speak briefly about license to kill? I forgot that term until you just said that.
Yeah. So, well, since we're talking about antipsychotics, I mean, that's kind of an old field, but but you're developing an antipsychotic. A company has it. They might be, well, it is a good example. They might be the third or fourth or fifth or sixth now, atypical antipsychotic, but on the days when there was the race to develop it, you might be the third one. You see somebody in academic doing something that could really interfere with your IP or your ideas or your product, and they license it, and then they just let it sit on the shelf and they don't do anything with it. So that's why you need that clawback. That doesn't happen always, and you probably get a sense it's going to happen, but maybe not always. So you need to have that clawback provision, and you need to make sure your university puts that in, because if they're going to do that, they won't license it with a clawback then. So does that answer your question, Steve?
Yes, I just wanted you to share with the group. I will say, in our example, we put in provisions that allowed some license to kill. And it sounds like a bad way, but the way we did it was you licensed broad enough IP, different products, with the idea that you didn't have to develop them all. You were going to develop something, the ones that
Right.
made sense. You were going to move things to the point that it made sense. So there were multiple products, one of which went forward, but it was all consistent with the agreement that you just had to be advancing the portfolio, not every single piece in the portfolio.
Right. But it's an important thing to remember.
So a question in the audience, Martin?
Yeah, if you don't mind jumping in. Yeah, I'm in actually at CHLA, affiliated with USC. I'm in their tech transfer group. I'm a corporate collaboration manager. I worked in industry for 15 years at Amgen and other companies, so I have a real good view of both sides of the coin. Just to comment on the terms that you were discussing there, business terms. Typically, at least all the offices I'm aware of, tech transfer offices, do not allow the inventors and the faculty to weigh in on those business terms because it's a distinct conflict of interest. So just to highlight that, you do need to, of course, in addition to have a good relationship with your tech transfer office, also trust that they will be advocating for your interests in that situation where, again, it really cannot be involving the faculty member.
I never got a vote or was involved in those conversations.
Yep.
Over 20 years, I came to understand them, but it's not like anybody asked my opinion.
You know, it's not that we wouldn't be happy to share the whole conversation with faculty members. It's really more a matter of conflict. And, you know, ultimately, if it were that seen at some point that you were, you know, getting some kickback or a special financial treatment there or whatever, then that would be really anathema to the, you know, academic mission and very harmful to the university's reputation. But it is, just as you said, about relinquishing control of the technology and the science. It's also true for the business side as well, that you really do need to trust that the tech transfer office has the expertise and is advocating on your behalf when it comes to business terms in licenses. But absolutely, clawback provisions, very important. We don't want technologies to just sit there to be, you know, killed essentially and not go anywhere. That's totally unacceptable as well. So you'll see licenses these days are pretty sophisticated and really envision, unfortunately, a wide spectrum of bad behavior that can take place on both sides of the aisle, and really have clauses and protections in them to prevent you know, those worst case scenarios from coming to fruition. So thank you. This is a great overview, and I agree with everything you guys are saying. And for those other participants, hope you're benefiting from this as well, because it's definitely, you know, we need to hear from you as the inventors, as the experts in your field, to essentially work as a partnership together to get things out of academia.
So Martin, it's fantastic that you're here. We have a lot of the trainees in the KL2 and just people in general in our seminar series from CHLA. Can you describe how what's the point of contact? How do they just make contact to say, you know, my name is Pradeep, this is what I do, I would like to have a relationship with your office?
Yeah, I mean, our door is always open. Office of Technology Commercialization at CHLA, OTC. You can find us on the research, Saban research website. Just right, we're part of research operations under Jody Ogden, and obviously our Chief Scientific Officer, Pat Levitt, you know, works closely and oversees our office as well. Chris Del Vecchio is our director. So he's a patent attorney, patent law, as well as tech transfer at UC Riverside, UC Santa Barbara, and was in venture capital for a while as well. Yeah, there's three of us in the office, myself, Adnan Hussein, and Chris Del Vecchio. Our door is always open, virtual door at this point. And always happy to talk to folks about their research, and look for ways to, as that was discussed earlier, look at IP aspects of it. Definitely agree with the don't publish or present. If you have any thought of trying to capture that IP, you'll forego rights in the rest of the world. The US has a 1-year grace period where you can get away with doing that. But if you have to get the best possible foundation for the IP, it's important to really take the time to just send us email and pick up the phone and talk to us before you publish or present your ideas that may have value, for sure.
Okay, and I just have a few more slides, but I think it's communication. We always hear that, but set up an agreement at the beginning that fosters participation throughout the development process. So you can be on a steering committee, you can be on the scientific advisory board, some way that you stay involved with the product. And some agreements have where there are steering committees that includes both the university and the pharma, where you do you look at milestone review, you do conflict resolution, and there may be a way that it gets escalated. But just on one-on-one, when you're working with pharma, you need your industry, your lines of communication need to be open and honest. And this is probably more to industry. It's a long-term relationship, and playing to always win isn't going to work. So, and that goes both ways. But I think that's important for industry to remember too. And something that might be hard to understand: that open access to data doesn't go both ways. Often industry has legal obligations of what can be shared, and you may not know something until it's made public. In a small company like us, almost any kind of data is material, and we have to share it with the public markets. And that's the same time that our investigators and collaborators find out about it. So that can be frustrating, but that's how it is to keep us honest with the SEC. And I think it's in pharma, the last point is important. We are under timelines, very micromanaged timelines, and everything we feel like was due yesterday. And I think that's just important that that's important to know that we may want an answer from you in 1 or 2 days. And we want that answer in 1 or 2 days. We don't want to hear that you're on vacation, you don't have your computer or whatever with you. No, we need that answer. So it's not like you can take a week or two to respond to questions. That it has to be, you have to be pretty nimble and quick. And if you're gone, put something in place that people can answer for you. This is, I think we've talked about it. But there has to be a big upside. It's what Steve talked about. And from industry to spend the time and millions of dollars. So it has to have a big advantage. And that's where you need to start thinking now. Your technology, your product, your biologic, it needs to have a big advantage over existing products that people working in industry can understand, how you're going to get to the market, and that they're going to make money. And this, I think, always, probably everybody knows this. High overhead in institutions often drives pharmaceutical companies and industry crazy. It's just one of the sources of conflict. You have to figure that out. And again, it's what we've talked about, having a way to manage and implement the collaboration, how to problem solve. And publications are important for both groups. Everybody wants to publish. It's just when it's going to happen. You can have some rules in place for that too. And this is things that I have found working for you to think about. If a company doesn't have experience working with university, it's going to be a it's going to be a lot harder collaboration. And they're going to probably burn through a few collaborations before they figure it out. So if you have a choice, you want to try to find pharma companies that are used to working with university and non-industry institutions. They'll have more processes in place to work with you, and it's going to be probably an easier collaboration. It's also important when you're thinking about where, who you're talking to and what industry you want to go with, what are their priorities? And this is, are they really committed to this area? Are they really committed to, advancing your product? Is it something that looks like they're really committed to in research? And this is just another one that we talked about. I already talked about, try to be on the scientific advisory board of the company. That's where you can provide advice and support. You're not going to direct activities, and you're also going to learn what they're doing. They may learn. That's where you also learn about the global projects, the global development, what people in other parts of the world think. So I think that's important too. And I think I just have one more slide. Who should you contact? I think you should contact, think of a lot of companies, go to meetings, contact people. And we already talked about this. Do a cold call and start at the top. I know that sounds crazy, but they're going to be much more interested. But find out if other people have connections, and, who do they talk to at companies? Know your competition in the therapeutic space. What are other companies doing? What are other universities doing? So you know what's going on, so you can differentiate and show that you are clinically meaningful. Come prepared with confidentiality agreements ready to execute. Come prepared with IP status, and I've already talked about be willing to share your data. So I kind of repeated the same things over and over, but I think you understand at least what's important when I'm talking to universities and academics. So any other questions, comments?
That's a really great presentation, Terri. I would add your last slide there. I think from the tech transfer office perspective, I'm a cancer biologist by training. I did drug discovery, small molecules, what have you, but I'm not an expert in CNS disorders, for instance. So it's really important, I think, as you approach folks, even at companies as well, that, probably at meetings, they'll have domain expertise and knowledge that they'll be able to connect with you on that. But outside of that, more in the business space or in the broader, sort of company perspective, to really have done your homework, as you said, Terri, that you're the expert in the field, you're the KOL, and understand what does the landscape look like, right? And what's the competition? And be prepared to defend your statements. Why you think you have something that's really outstanding, novel, first in class kind of approach to this, and that will I think build credibility and open doors as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Terri. This was a ton of information, a ton of effort to pull this all together for us today, which I really appreciate. I think we all do. And for those of you in the audience, if you have questions, but haven't sort of formulated them yet or don't know how to ask, please reach out. Oh, we have a couple of we just still have another hand raised, which is good. So after, I'll just say this and then we'll hand over to Pradeep. I'm happy to try to answer any questions I can or to connect you to someone who can if I can't. So Pradeep, what was your question?
Thank you. This isn't, I think, directly in line with this presentation, but I think you all would have the expertise to answer some of these questions. But for example, if you have an idea, not drug discovery, because I'm an ED doc, so I'm not going to be discovering drugs, but if you have an idea or a set of ideas, and you encounter technologies that may be beneficial to test out that idea. And you're interested in partnering with industry in regards to sort of exploring the academic side and research side. How does that sort of fit in those industry academic collaborations when it comes to involving like tech transfer office, or is that a separate domain that's sort of handled externally from that? I guess a corollary in biopharma would be, you know, if we're seeing a disease or a process that may benefit from maybe an FDA approved drug, and you have an idea for a research study and you want to partner, how does the sort of process play out from the investigator's standpoint? I don't know if that's a fair question or if it makes sense.
Well, from my point of view, I mean, I think things like that are probably discussed at scientific meetings. Or if you know somebody in industry, to talk to them. If you want to get funding, I mean, industry does fund research. I mean, a lot of research. So I think it's a little bit different, but we fund a ton of research that may not be directly applicable to us any day, that day, but it can be helpful in the down the road. Hi, Steve.
I was going to say we might add the concept of right of first refusal and how that might come into sponsored research agreements. And Martin, I'm glad you're here and shaking your head. So maybe someone can describe this concept of, we'll fund your research. We're not going to make terms in advance for things that don't yet exist, but we will put some provisions in place that give us a place in line to bid.
Yeah, that's right. I think from the clinical side, obviously being at CHLA, I'd say the majority of our corporate interactions are of clinical in nature. They're either investigator initiated or sponsored from industry. In that case, very little likelihood of IP being created. You're using the partner's IP, their molecules, their devices, whatever. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no value that you can add from that interaction or that collaboration. And certainly as a consultant for the company, that's very common. Clinicians, key opinion leaders very often will consult for money, and that's allowed under the hospital's rules and most academic institutions as well. Carve out 10, 20% of your time is part of your contract in terms of being able to do those sorts of consultancies. So that's definitely something that is well within your rights to do that. If it's about trying to take a novel idea, let's say in orthopedics, like a bone graft device, or maybe something that's more device in nature, or even digital health solutions as well, there's a more of a gray area, and there's potential for intellectual property to be created in that process. So there you want to work closely with your contracts office and tech transfer potentially to make sure there's terms in that agreement that provide for, should there be a new invention made or new method of use for a device, something like that. And I think that brings out the last thing I'll just close on here is the importance of agreements and contracts in all of these interactions and collaborations. They're really key to making sure that both parties are doing the right thing, and there's provisions in there when like Terri said, if things maybe don't go right, it's research after all, there's ways to get it back on track and to keep that relationship functioning.
Did they answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions before we end for the day? Going once? Yes, Michael.
Yeah, so it's probably a little bit of a targeted question, because I'm also in the neuro space, but on neurocog as opposed to affective disorders. And this is kind of a tricky area when one is going from preclinical studies to translational studies. And I'm wondering if you have any advice on how you navigate that whole, not just the pre-IND, but kind of the pre-IND, and how you prepare to either go towards large animals, or what type of intermediate does one go from, say, a mouse model to then a clinical trial?
Right. I mean, that is the question. I think it's very specific to each indication. And I think that's where you need to work with colleagues and talk to colleagues, who brought products forward, and also talk to colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry. And you just want to be careful because you don't want to do something that might not help your product, right? So that's, I think that is a really tricky, and you don't want to get something you think is proof of concept. If it didn't work, then if you have a good explanation, that's okay. But I think that's tricky. And that's where, you can, maybe you start a collaboration early. I think maybe Steve has something to say about that.
I think this is where industry sponsored, studies. So it's having the protection either through confidentiality agreements, non-disclosure agreements, or a patent, right? To be able to have the conversation where you can say, I've got data in a rodent. What would be necessary? And, so you need one rodent, one non-rodent species. They may guide you in ways you wouldn't have understood, right? You're going to propose to do a study in rabbits, but it turns out that your product really needs to be tested in pigs. And you don't have the resources to do that, but they do. And you may end up, finding a path forward that you would have not understood. So that's a very specific example, but I think this is where, protect, collaborate, learn is really, really important. I'll just add one sort of unsolicited anecdote. We got one set of reviews back on a paper where a reviewer said, they've done it in mice and rats and rabbits. They need to do a non-rodent species. And the response to review, this was an academic review, where, rabbits are not rodents. So, you'll find a lot of, sort of lack of expertise in academia, like somebody who's happy to review your work, but doesn't know that rabbits are not rodents. So you got to get the expertise where it lives.
Yeah. And
I would add to that as well. Michael, I think it's well within your rights and your expertise to go to the FDA for a pre guidance as well. We have some recipients at CHLA, Tracy Grickscheid, who's doing stem cell biology and at this point Hirschsprung's disease and innervating the gut. And she has used some of her CERM funding to put together, getting a consultant basically to help her put together a document, initial pre-IND document. And the feedback, the guidance from that meeting really helped her in terms of what was going to be acceptable and not acceptable.
That's a great idea, Martin. I mean, that's, of course, yes. And Steve had done that too, right?
I was going to say, you see us shaking our heads. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
I went to one of our offices and they helped me. We set up like a pre-IND meeting. The FDA was really happy to help and much kinder, right? Because it was very clear. I was not coming to them on equal footing, like as someone who could go head to head with them. I was really just asking for help. And they were really kind and taught me all the things I needed to do so that I had like a packet to present to NewPath of things the FDA told me I needed and had done some of them.
And they're really, I think I've seen that they're really great about that, because it is that you're not a pharma, and they are very good at that. Is a really good way to go. If you have to have some data, but if you have some data, they will do that. And I think and now with Zooms, it's probably even much easier to get those meetings. So it's a great idea, Martin. I forgot all about that.
Thank you.
Oh, again, thank you, Terri. Thank you, Martin, for being such an active participant. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who came today to listen and learn and chime in, and look forward to seeing you all at the next Career Development Seminar Series.